Good morning. My name is Bruce Jones, and I serve as pastor of Plata United Methodist Church in Plata, Maryland. This video is an experiment of sorts. We had to cancel our worship services this morning because of the great snowstorm of 2009, and normally the message that I had prepared would have been placed in the drawer and never used. Pat Nolan, our church's lay leader and our webmaster, felt bad that I had worked so hard to prepare a sermon which would go unheard and from which no one would eventually get any benefit. So we concocted an idea that we might try an experiment and record a message on video, and we would post it on the website. You'll have to forgive whatever technical mistakes and challenges you may see while you're watching this message, but I do thank you for watching it online. My message this morning is entitled, You Magnify the Lord. I was going to start my message standing in the pulpit and asking people, why are you here? But because of the snow and our canceling the services, you aren't here. And for that matter, neither am I. I can't ask you, why aren't you here? Since we all know the answer to that question. So perhaps all I can really say is, I wish we were all here. I was going to ask, why are you here, to get us thinking. The question has nothing to do with your present location. I was talking about the purpose of your life. I'm talking about the fact that God created you, equipped you with special talents and abilities. God blessed you and has called you to be connected to Him. I'm talking about doing something with your life so that your life and your soul magnify the Lord. Florence grew up in a comfortable, well-to-do family that was well connected to English society, but she had no interest in the expectations or conventions of her parents' social network. At the age of 16, she began to feel a strong sense that God was calling her to have a very great purpose for her life. When she was 20 years old, her grandmother became quite ill, and because Flo wasn't married yet, she was asked to provide the care for her elderly grandmother. Over the years, she provided the most loving caregiving, and she realized that she had within herself a passion for caring for the sick and the dying. Florence decided that she wanted to become a nurse. But nursing was very different back then. It was menial work, not much more than emptying bedpans and typical housekeeping. So her father forbade her from becoming a nurse because he believed that it was below her. This drove her then to begin to develop an interest in public health. Now, when she was 25 years old, during the Crimean War, there was a great need for nurses in the army hospitals, and one had been set up in Turkey. On her own, she volunteered and became a nurse at that army hospital in Turkey. Though the male doctors restricted the nurses from doing anything but the most difficult and dirty work, she began to provide truly compassionate care for the wounded soldiers. Now, eventually, the general who was in charge of the hospital noticed the wonderful care that she was providing and brought her aside and asked her if she would develop a program for the nurses so that they would all learn how to give the kind of care that she gave. Over time, she completely reorganized the hospital to be very efficient, to provide clean sheets, clean dressings, and clean clothing for the soldiers. Her ideas were so well received that she was invited to reorganize and train the nursing programs at other English military hospitals. She became recognized throughout the country as a person who elevated nursing to a helping medical profession, providing real and tangible medical care for the wounded and the sick in England's hospitals. She revolutionized nursing and helped it become more like what it is today. Her name was Florence Nightingale. Who was Florence? Just a young woman determined to make a difference with her life. Well, who was Mary? She was just a young girl. Likely she was only 15 or 16 years old. She certainly wasn't from a rich family, but there's no evidence that she was poor. What would her life have been like had she not given birth to the Savior of the world? Her life likely would have been no more significant than that of her mother, or her sisters, or her friends, or any of another millions of women who lived between BC and AD. Yet this one teenage girl offered herself as a servant of God, and God blessed her. And now, some 2,000 years later, we still talk about her. And we still wonder if we would have, or could have, made the same decision and choice that she made. Do we care too much about what others think of us? Do we wish only to fit in, become a part of the backdrop, because standing out is too difficult? God gives us the choice to be a nobody if we want. We can sink back into the crowd and do nothing out of the ordinary with our lives. We can live a perfectly average life and contribute very little to the advancement of human history. We can decide that we have nothing to offer, that there isn't anything that we can do to advance the will of God. But just as equally, we could live lives that magnify the Lord. Let me tell you that God has a dream and a plan for every person he has ever created. Those who are open to God's ideas and open to God's plan for them live such extraordinary lives that, as Mary described in her Magnificat, future generations remember them and call them blessed. The starting point, the key, I think, is to respond to God's call in our lives just the way Mary did. We all can learn to say, "Here I am, the Lord's servant. Let it be unto me, as you have said." Now, like Mary, like Jesus, like Peter and Paul and all the other apostles, like Florence Nightingale and many others, doing God's will does not assure that everything will be wonderful and to go well. In fact, as we stand in opposition to the vast majority of people who do not follow God's will, we will almost always encounter resistance and opposition. Mary encountered the sneers of the women in her community, and had it not been that Joseph was willing to marry her, she might well have been stoned as a promiscuous young girl. Consider also the long journey she had to take to Bethlehem when she was nearly full term. Consider having to give birth in a stable with the animals looking on. Consider having to flee shortly after giving birth because King Herod was out to harm her new baby. Mary's life wasn't easy, but what she accomplished was one of the most important things in the whole world. When you and I decide to do God's will, when we decide to follow God's plan for our lives, when we decide to make the necessary sacrifices to accomplish something great for God, then our lives magnify the Lord. To the degree that each of us do things from time to time to bless others and to do God's will, then we have magnified the Lord, and ultimately that is our job. That's our calling, our purpose here on earth. Our task is to fulfill our purpose, to fulfill our destiny, to become exactly the person that God created us to be, and to do good in accordance with the situations and the circumstances that God gives us. If you seize these moments, if you live that life, if you give your life to Christ, and indeed, then you will magnify the Lord. I pray that in our lives, we all will. Amen.